Imagine standing on a mountain peak, watching death march toward you through the trees below. Not the organized columns of European warfare, but something far more terrifying. 1,000 silent hunters, each one capable of putting a lead ball through your eye at 200 yards. Each one moving like a ghost through the forest. Each one hungry for blood. Major Patrick Ferguson, Britain's most feared commander in the American South, is about to learn the deadliest lesson of his military career. Never threaten a man who has nothing left to lose. This is October 7, 1780, and in the next 60 minutes, the entire course of the American Revolution is about to change forever. The Wolf of the Emperor. Let me tell you about a different kind of American hero. Forget the powdered wigs and fancy uniforms. Forget the educated gentleman debating philosophy in Philadelphia. William Campbell was 6 feet of pure frontier fury in a world where most men stood barely 5 feet 6. His hands could split a log or snap a man's neck with equal ease. His ease described as either piercing blue or cold gray, depending on who you asked. Could spot a deer at 300 yards or see straight through a liaress soul. Born in 1745 in Virginia's Augusta County, Campbell grew up where civilization ended and hell began. This wasn't the Virginian of tobacco plantations and genteel society. This was the edge of the known world, a place where your nearest neighbor might be miles away, where Native American war parties could strike without warning, and where every cabin had gun ports cut into the walls because they weren't decorative. Here's what you need to understand. The Scots-Irish who settled this land weren't running to America. They were running from persecution, poverty, and kings who treated them like slaves. They'd been kicked out of Scotland for backing the wrong rebellion. They'd been persecuted in Ireland for refusing to bow to the Anglican Church. They'd crossed an ocean to escape tyranny. And when they carved farms out of virgin wilderness with nothing but axes and pure stubborn rage, they made themselves a promise. Never again would anyone tell them how to live. Campbell's father was one of these iron-willed immigrants. He taught young William that a man's worth was UNT, measured by his family name, or Patriot, was measured by his ability to protect and provide for his people. In this world, weakness meant death, hesitation meant death, dependence on others meant death. So they became self-reliant to the point of obsession. Forged in blood and powder, picture young William Campbell, maybe 8 years old, holding a rifle nearly as tall as himself. His father hands him exactly 10 lead balls for the entire winter. Make them count. Boy, miss your shots. We don't eat. This wasn't a game. This was survival. And it created the most dangerous marksmen the world had ever seen. While British soldiers were trained to stand in neat rows and fire in the general direction of the enemy, frontier boys were learning to shoot squirrels in the head to preserve the meat. They practiced barking, shooting the tree bark beneath the squirrel so precisely that the concussion killed the animal without damaging the pelt. They could decapitate a turkey at 100 paces. Every shot mattered because powder and lead cost money that frontier families didn't have. A boy might get 10 or 15 practice rounds in an entire year. So he learned to check his powder charge carefully, load the ball precisely, aim with surgical accuracy, and squeeze the trigger smoothly. By the time Campbell was a man, he could read wind and distance like you read a book. He could just trajectory instinctively. He could put a .50 caliber ball through a playing card at 200 yards and then do it again and again. But Campbell learned something more valuable than marksmanship in those brutal frontier years. He learned that real leadership wasn't about rank or title. It was about earning respect through action. When a bar needed raising, every man in the district showed up because they knew others would show up for them. When raiders struck, men fought together or died alone. This created bonds of mutual obligation and trust that ran deeper than blood, deeper than law. They were forged in mutual survival and absolute trust. Campbell absorbed a crucial lesson. In the frontier world, you couldn't command respect, you had to earn it. Officers weren't appointed by some distant authority. They were elected by the men they'd lead. And if those men didn't respect you, they simply wouldn't follow you. No amount of rank or a uniform would change that. This egalitarian, almost democratic approach to leadership would prove revolutionary when applied to warfare. a different kind of army when the Revolution erupted in 1775 with the battles at Lexington and Concord. The war must have seemed distant to people living on the Virginia frontier. Those fights happened in a different world, a world of cities and stone buildings, of formal armies and political debates and colonial assemblies. The frontier had its own immediate concerns: defending against Native American raids, establishing land claims, building communities in the wilderness, simply surviving another winter. But Campbell understood something that many professional soldiers didn't. This war would eventually reach the frontier, and when it did, they'd need fighters who understood wilderness warfare, not European pre-ground tactics. He accepted a captain's commission in the Virginia militia in 1776 and faced an impossible task: turning individualistic hunters into an organized fighting force. These men had never marched in formation. They'd never drilled with muskets in neat rows. They elected their officers by vote and wouldn't follow a man they didn't respect, regardless of his rank. They had no uniforms, no standard equipment, and absolutely zero interest in military discipline as Europe understood it. They were farmers who would grab their rifles when called, fight until the danger passed, then return to their fields and families. They supplied their own weapons, their own horses if they had them, their own food and ammunition. Any conventional officer would have tried to force these men into the European military mold. Teach them to march in step, stand in neat lines, fire on command, without thinking. Turn them into interchangeable parts of a military machine. Campbell did something genius instead. He didn't try to change them. He recognized that these men already possessed skills that no military academy could teach. They were expert marksmen. They knew how to move silently through forests. They understood terrain instinctively. They could think independently and adapt to changing situations. What they needed wasn't to become European soldiers. They needed to become better at what they already were. So Campbell organized shooting competitions where men would compete for small prizes, honing their skills while building unit cohesion and friendly rivalry. He taught them to operate in small groups, moving through forests to surround an enemy position like they'd surround a deer. He drilled them in fire and movement tactics. Some men shoot while others advance, then switch roles. He taught them to use terrain for cover and concealment, to always take high ground when possible, to avoid silhouetting themselves against the sky. Most revolutionary. Campbell taught his militia to think, unlike conventional soldiers who were trained to follow orders without question, to be cogs in a machine. Campbell's riflemen were encouraged to use their judgment, see a better position, take it, spot an enemy officer making himself a target, drop him, find yourself cut off from the main force. Do you want to die in a pointless, heroic last stand, infiltrate back to friendly lines and live to fight another day? This required treating them as intelligent men capable of making life or death decisions, not as automatons to be controlled. Professional officers would have called this dangerously undisciplined. They would have predicted chaos and disaster. Campbell knew it was the only approach that would work with frontiersmen, who'd spent their entire lives making independent decisions that meant the difference between survival and death. He was creating something entirely new. A hybrid force that combined the discipline and coordination of a military unit with the individual initiative and marksmanship of frontier hunters. The British had never faced anything like it. The marriage that sealed his fate in the midst of preparing for war. Campbell's personal life took a turn that would tie him irrevocably to the Patriot cause. He married his cousin Elizabeth Henry and, yes, she was that Henry, sister of Patrick Henry, the fiery orator who de-electrified the colonies with his passionate "give me liberty or give me death" speech. This wasn't just a love story, though by all accounts William and Elizabeth were devoted to each other. It was a political alliance that united two powerful forces in Virginia's Patriot movement. Elizabeth could read Latin and French, skills that were rare even among educated men of the era. She brought refinement and connection to Virginia's educated Tidewater elite, but she was no delicate flower. She was tough enough to manage a frontier farm alone while her husband went to war, brave enough to face constant danger, and determined enough to support years of military service that kept Campbell away from home for months at a time. Think about what that meant. Managing a farm in hostile territory, protecting children from potential raids, making life or death decisions about when to flee and when to stand, all while not knowing if your husband was alive or dead. This marriage united the educated Tidewater elite with the rough frontier warriors. The philosophical foundations of the revolution were the fighting men who would win it. Campbell now had connections to Virginia's political leadership, but he also had everything to lose. His wife, his home, his future, all tied to the success or failure of American independence. But Campbell's commitment to the Patriot cause went deeper than family ties or political connections. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, Parliament's attempts to tax and regulate the colonies weren't abstract grievances to frontier families. They were exactly the tyrannical government control the Scots-Irish had crossed an ocean to escape. Campbell and his neighbors had left behind a world where distant authority has told them what they could do, where they could live, how they should worship, and what taxes they owed. They'd come to America specifically to escape that control. They'd carved farms out of wilderness, defended them with blood, and built communities based on mutual aid and self-governance. Now a king 3,000 miles away wanted to impose taxes without representation, wanted to station soldiers in their homes, wanted to tell them how they could trade and what they owed. Not happening. When news reached the backcountry about Lexington and Concord, about British soldiers firing on American militiamen, about farmers and merchants standing up to the world's most powerful army, Campbell and his neighbors understood instantly what was at stake. This was the eternal fight between those who wanted to control people's lives and those who demanded to be left free, between those who believed in hierarchy and obedience and those who believed in liberty and self-determination. The frontier was about to go to war, and William Campbell would lead them. The storm gathering by 1780. The revolution in the South was going catastrophically badly for the American cause. Charleston, the key southern port, had fallen to British forces. An entire American army had surrendered. British and Loyalist forces controlled the major cities and most of the Carolina backcountry. Patriot families were being terrorized, their farms burned, their men hanged as traitors. The British believed they'd broken the back of rebellion in the South. They thought victory was just a matter of time and pacification. And then Major Patrick Ferguson made the worst mistake of his military career. Ferguson was no ordinary British officer. He was arguably the most innovative military mind in the British Army, inventor of the Ferguson rifle, the first practical breech-loading rifle adopted by the British military. He was brave, intelligent, and absolutely ruthless in suppressing Patriot resistance. He commanded a mixed force of British regulars and Loyalist militia, and he'd been devastatingly effective at crushing Patriot resistance in the Carolina backcountry. Farms burned, leaders hanged, families terrorized into submission. Ferguson believed the over-mountain men, the frontier settlers living west of the Appalachian Mountains in what would become Tennessee, were too far away and too disorganized to threaten his operations, so he sent them a message meant to intimidate them into neutrality. The message threatened that if the over-mountain men continued supporting the Patriot cause, he would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. He threatened their families, their homes, their freedom. Ferguson thought he was intimidating scattered settlers who would flee before trained British regulars. He thought he was delivering a warning that would keep them out of the war. He couldn't have been more catastrophically wrong. He'd just lit a fuse that would explode directly in his face. Because what Ferguson didn't understand, what no European officer understood, was that these were UNT peasants to be cowed by threats. These weren't subjects who had bowed to superior force and aristocratic authority. These were men who'd carved civilization out of wilderness with nothing but rifles and pure stubborn determination. Men who'd fought Native American warriors to a standstill in brutal forest combat. Men whose entire culture was built on the principle that no one, not kings, not lords, not generals, tells them what to do. Ferguson's threat didn't terrify them, it unified them, enraged them. It gave them a specific, personal target for all their accumulated fury at British oppression. You want to threaten our families, you want to burn our homes, you want to hang our leaders? Come try it. Within days, word spread from cabin to cabin, valley to valley, settlement to settlement. A British officer has threatened our families. Time to deal with him. Militia companies began mustering across the frontier. Not because some general ordered them, not because the Continental Congress demanded it, but because free men decided, individually and collectively, that Patrick Ferguson needed to be stopped. William Campbell assembled his Virginia militia, 400 rough, tough frontier fighters who could shoot the wings off a fly at 200 yards. They joined with Isaac Shelby's men from what would become Tennessee, John Sevier's Over Mountain Boys, Benjamin Cleveland's North Carolina militia, and others. In total, nearly 1,000 mounted riflemen. No uniforms, they wore their everyday hunting shirts and leggings. No supply train, each man brought his own food and ammunition. No artilleries, they had no way to transport cannons through mountain terrain anyway. No military band, no flags, no formal organization. Just men, horses, rifles, and cold determination. They elected their overall commander by consensus. Campbell would lead, with Shelby, Sevier, and others commanding their respective units. True frontier democracy leadership by consent of the lead. They set out to hunt Patrick Ferguson like they'd hunt a dangerous predator threatening their families. And they were very, very good at hunting. The hunt, the pursuit that followed, was a masterclass in frontier warfare. Ferguson knew the overmounted men were coming. His scouts brought him word of the approaching force. But he made a series of fatal miscalculations based on his European military training. First, he assumed that a force of militia would move slowly, be poorly organized, and give up if he stayed ahead of them. He didn't understand that these men could cover 30 to 40 miles a day on horseback through mountain terrain, sleeping rough and living off whatever they could hunt or carry. Second, he assumed they'd be intimidated by his reputation and the presence of British regulars in his force. He didn't understand that these men had been fighting and winning in the wilderness. Since childhood, British uniforms didn't impress them. Third, and most fatally, he assumed he could choose favorable ground and force them to attack him in a conventional battle where his training and discipline would prevail. Ferguson retreated to a ridge called King mountain and elevation in what is now the border region between North and South Carolina. The ridge was about 600 yards long and 60 to 120 yards wide at the top, with steep slopes on all sides. From a European military perspective, this seemed like excellent defensive terrain. His men held the high ground. Attackers would have to advance uphill, exposed to fire from above. The steep slopes would break up any organized assault. If the militia attacked, Ferguson believed his disciplined troops could pour devastating fire down on them and break their assault. He'd forgotten or never understood that these weren't European soldiers planning a frontal assault. These were hunters. And hunters don't charge straight at dangerous prey. On October 7, 1780, Campbell and the other frontier commanders approached Kings Mountain and quickly assessed the situation. They didn't see a fortress. They saw a trap, but for Ferguson, not for them. The commanders held a quick council. The plan was brilliantly simple, taking advantage of everything that made frontier riflemen deadly. They would surround the mountain completely. Every unit would advance up the slopes simultaneously from different directions. They would use trees and rocks for cover, advancing in their own time, not in neat formations. Each man would pick his own targets. Officers and NCOs were priority target skill. The leaders in the unit falls apart. And critically, if British troops counterattacked with bayonets down any slope, that unit would fall back down the hill while the units on other slopes would press forward. Ferguson couldn't defend all directions simultaneously. Campbell took command of the Virginia militia on one section of the attack. His orders to his men were simple and direct: shout like hell and fight like devils. Then they began the climb. 15 minutes had changed history. Picture the scene from Ferguson's perspective. You're standing atop King S Mountain with roughly 1,000 loyalist militia and a smaller corps of British regulars. You've chosen excellent defensive ground. You're confident in your tactical position. Then you look down the slopes and see something that makes your blood run cold. Silent figures emerging from the trees on all sides, not marching in formation, not announcing themselves with drums and flags, just materializing like ghosts, using every tree and rock for cover, surrounding your entire position. You're not facing an army. You're facing a closing trap. Ferguson's men opened fire first, but here's where European training failed them. They were firing muskets downhill at targets in cover at 100+ yards. The balls were flying high, an eternal problem with shooting downhill and hitting mostly trees and rocks. The frontier riflemen advanced steadily, individually, each man using his judgment about when to move and when to shoot. When they got within effective range, that magical 150 to 200 yards where the long rifle became devastating, they began picking off Ferguson's men with surgical precision. A loyalist soldier would peek over a rock to fire and take a ball through the head. An officer would stand to rally his men and drop with a ball through the chest. Men started falling with wounds to the head, neck, and upper chests, the exposed parts, when they tried to fire downhill. Ferguson recognized the danger and did what his training told him to do. He organized bayonet charges down the slopes to break up the assault. This was standard European tactic when facing long-range fire. Close the distance with cold steel. His loyalist militia, many armed with muskets and bayonets, charged down one slope in formation, and it worked. The frontier fighters on that slope fell back before the bayonet charge, seemingly fleeing in disorder. Ferguson probably felt a moment of savage triumph. They were running, but they weren't running. They were executing exactly the tactic Campbell had taught them. As Ferguson's men charged down one slope, the riflemen on the other slopes pressed forward unimpeded. They advanced up the now less defended sections of the ridge, pouring accurate fire into the loyalists from the flanks and rear. Ferguson's charging troops reached the bottom of the slope and found themselves under withering fire from multiple directions. They had to retreat back uphill, and as they climbed, exhausted and exposed, the riflemen they'd been chasing turned around and started shooting them in the back. Men dropped with every step. Officers fell. NCOs fell. Anyone who tried to organize the retreat became a priority target. Ferguson tried this tactic again and again, bayonet charges down different slopes. Each time, the same thing happened. The riflemen on that slope would fall back while the riflemen on all the other slopes advanced. Ferguson's men would get caught in crossfire, take casualties, and have to retreat back uphill. The trap was closing. Campbell, fighting with his Virginia militia, was everywhere in the battle. His massive frame made him an obvious target, but he seemed to bear a charmed life. He moved up the slope with his men, encouraging them, directing fire, calling out targets. When loyalist troops charged down toward his section, he calmly ordered his men to fall back, wait for the crossfire from other units to do its work, then advance again. He wasn't commanding from the rear like a European general. He was fighting alongside his men, rifle in hand, leading by example. The battle lasted less than an hour, but it was the longest hour of Ferguson's life and his last. Ferguson, recognizable by his British uniform and officer's sword, became a priority target for every rifleman who saw him. He fought bravely, trying desperately to rally his men and organize an effective defense. But the situation was hopeless. His forces were completely surrounded. They were taking fire from all directions. His officers were being systematically eliminated. His men were being shot down faster than they could reload. Multiple riflemen claimed to have killed Ferguson. Probably several balls hit him almost simultaneously. He fell from his horse with at least 7 or 8 bullet wounds, dying almost instantly. With Ferguson dead and their position hopeless, white flags began appearing across the Loyalist lines. But here's where the dark side of frontier warfare showed itself. Many of the riflemen didn't want to accept surrender. This wasn't a formal European battle with rules of civilized warfare. This was personal. Ferguson had threatened their families. Loyalist militia had burned Patriot farms and hanged Patriot leaders. There were scores to settle and blood debts to pay. Some of the frontiersmen continued firing even after white flags appeared, shouting Tarleton's Quarter, a reference to a British cavalry officer who'd allegedly massacred surrendering Americans at an earlier battle. It took Campbell and the other officers physically moving through their lines, pushing rifles up, shouting at their men to stop firing, to finally end the killing. In less than an hour of combat, Major Patrick Ferguson was over. 150 Loyalists were killed, over 160 were wounded, the rest surrendered American casualties. 28 killed and 62 wounded. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The most lopsided Patriot victory of the entire Southern campaign. The earthquake, the immediate aftermath of Kings Mountain, was ugly. The frontier riflemen, their blood up from combat and years of accumulated grievances, wanted revenge. Some of the Loyalist prisoners were beaten. In the days following the battle, several Loyalist officers were given quick trials and hanged for alleged war crimes, atrocities committed against Patriot families. Campbell and the other officers struggled to maintain discipline and prevent wholesale massacres. It was a reminder that, while frontier democracy produced effective soldiers, it also produced men who felt personally invested in the conflict and its outcomes. But the strategic impact of Kings Mountain was earthquake-level significant. The British had just lost their most effective Loyalist commander and 1,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, and more importantly, they'd lost the aura of invincibility. British commanders had assumed that trained soldiers with bayonets could always defeat militia in open combat. Kings Mountain proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Frontier riflemen, using their own tactics on terrain, they understood, had completely destroyed a mixed British and Loyalist force. The psychological impact rippled across the South. For the British, Kings Mountain meant they couldn't safely operate in the backcountry. The interior was hostile territory controlled by men who could disappear into forests and mountains, then emerge to destroy isolated British forces. Lord Cornwallis, the British commander in the South, had to abandon his planned invasion of North Carolina and retreat to South Carolina. His entire strategic plan was in ruins. For Loyalists, the defeat broke the back of Loyalist militia organizing in the region. If Ferguson's force could be destroyed so completely, what hope did less capable Loyalist units have? Many Loyalists who'd been sitting on the fence or supporting the British out of fear decided that the Patriots might actually win. Neutrality or quiet support for the Patriots became safer than active loyalism. For Patriots, Kings Mountain proved that the revolution wasn't dead in the South. British victories at Charleston and Camden had made many Patriots despair. Kings Mountain showed that British forces could be beaten, that the cause wasn't lost, that resistance was possible. The battle energized Patriot resistance throughout the South. Militia companies that had been hiding in the hills began operating openly again. Patriot sympathizers who'd been lying low began providing intelligence and support. The entire momentum of the Southern campaign shifted. Historians trace a direct line from Kings Mountain to Copence, another Patriot victory a few months later, to Guilford Courthouse, where British forces technically won but took such heavy casualties they were crippled, to Yorktown, where Cornwallis surrendered, effectively ending the war. None of those later events happened without Kings Mountain changing the strategic situation in the South. And William Campbell was one of the key commanders who made it happen. The man who changed Ashestiorao after Kings Mountain. Campbell returned to Virginia and continued serving in the militia. He fought in other engagements, continued organizing frontier defense, and remained active in the Patriot cause until the war ended. But here's the tragedy. William Campbell didn't live to see the full fruits of the independence he fought for. He died in 1781 at the age of 36. Possibly from complications of wounds received during the war, though the exact cause isn't certain. Elizabeth Henry Campbell survived him by many years, living to see the United States become a reality, living to see the Constitution ratified, living to see her brother Patrick Henry's legacy secured in American history. Campbell died young, but his legacy was enormous. He proved that American militia could defeat British regulars when fighting on their own terms with their own tactics. European officers had assumed that formal training and discipline would always triumph over irregular forces. Campbell showed that marksmanship, terrain awareness, and independent thinking could overcome conventional military advantages. He demonstrated a new model of military leadership, not command through rank and authority, but leadership through earned respect and proven competence. His men followed him because they trusted his judgment and believed he had their interests at heart. not because some distant authority had given him a commission. He helped save the American Revolution in the South at a moment when British victory seemed inevitable. Without Kings Mountain, the entire Southern campaign might have collapsed, giving Britain control of the region and potentially prolonging the war for years. But beyond these military achievements, Campbell represented something fundamental about the American experiment. He embodied the idea that free men, fighting for their homes and families, could defeat professional soldiers fighting for pay and empire. That liberty produced better fighters than tyranny. That a people who governed themselves could defend themselves better than subjects obeying distant kings. The British never understood this. They kept assuming that European military doctrine would eventually prevail, that formal training would overcome frontier improvisation, that hierarchy and discipline would triumph over individual initiative. They were wrong. And men like William Campbell proved it with blood and gunpowder on an obscure mountain ridge in the Carolina Back. Epilogue. The echoes stand today at Kings Mountain National Military Park, and you can walk the ground where Campbell and his men fought. The ridge is still there, wooded and steep. You can imagine how it must have looked to Ferguson, thinking he'd chosen perfect defensive ground. You can picture frontier riflemen emerging from the trees like smoke, surrounding the position, closing the trap. There's a monument to Ferguson near where he fell. There are markers for the American commanders, including Campbell. Park rangers give talks about the battle's significance. But here's what strikes you when you visit. This wasn't a grand battlefield like Gettysburg or Antietam. It's not a sweeping landscape where you can see for miles. It's a forested ridge in rough country, the kind of terrain where visibility is measured in dozens of yards, not hundreds. It's exactly the kind of place where frontier riflemen would have every advantage. Campbell and his fellow commanders understood this instinctively. They didn't need military academy training to read terrain. They didn't need textbooks on tactics to know how to hunt dangerous prey. They'd been doing it their entire lives. They just applied those skills to the most dangerous prey of all, British soldiers who threatened their freedom. The American Revolution was won by many people making many sacrifices in many places. Grand Continental Army battles get most of the attention in history books: Valley Forge, Saratoga, Yorktown. But it was also won in obscure places by men whose names most people have forgotten. Men like William Campbell, leading frontier riflemen up a wooded ridge in the Carolina backcountry, proving that free men fighting for their homes were the most formidable soldiers on earth. Ferguson thought he was facing disorganized militia who would break and run at the first sign of British discipline and bayonets. He learned, in the last hour of his life, that he was facing something far more dangerous: American citizens who would rather die than surrender their freedom. That lesson echoes through American history. It echoed at Bunker Hill and Saratoga, at the Alamo and Gettysburg, through 2 world wars and beyond. The idea that free people, fighting for principles they believe in, are unstoppable. William Campbell helped teach the British Empire that lesson on October 7, 1780. And America never forgot at the end.